Hi, this is your host. In 1861, a quarry worker in Germany stumbled upon a strange assortment of bones while working in the limestone quarry. At first, he thought it was the bones of a bird that had been picked clean by a fox, but soon it became clear that it wasn't anything like any living bird. The discovery caused quite a stir in scientific circles because it was unlike anything anyone had seen before. The fossil turned out to be the skeleton of a bird with a tail and teeth like a reptile. And because of the unusual mix of features, it took paleontologists over a century to figure out where the animal fit in the grand scheme of life. Today, we know that the fossil, nicknamed the Archaeopteryx, was one of the earliest known birds. It lived roughly 150 million years ago during the Jurassic period. Birds are dinosaurs, so naming a dinosaur as the first bird is kind of like calling a chihuahua the first dog. Not exactly. Okay, so birds are technically a type of theropod dinosaur, a group that includes famous carnivores like Tyrannosaurus rex and Velociraptor. But the relationship between dinosaurs and birds is a bit complicated. Dinosaurs evolved into birds over a span of about 100 million years. So there wasn't a single ancestral population that suddenly transformed into birds as we know them today. Instead, scientists believe that multiple groups of theropods gave rise to birds independently. But these ancient birds didn't just pop out of nowhere. They descended from small, feathered dinosaurs called Maniraptorans. Maniraptorans were a diverse group that first appeared about 230 million years ago. They ranged in size from being roughly the size of a chicken to being roughly the size of a human. Over time, various groups of Maniraptorans developed feathers, started to resemble modern birds more closely, and eventually gave rise to the first birds. Unfortunately, the transition from dinosaurs to birds is pretty poorly documented in the fossil record. That's partly because birds have hollow bones that are adapted for flight, which makes them less suited for fossilization. Of the few fossils that do exist, most are just fragments of feathers or single bones. As a result, it can be difficult to tell which extinct animals were closely related to birds and which weren't. Take Archaeopteryx, for example. When it was first discovered, many scientists argued over whether it was a bird at all. The thing is, there was no single feature that could be used to define what a bird is. So paleontologists had to rely on educated guesses about which features were most important. Today we know that Archaeopteryx was definitely a bird because it had feathers. But back in the late 1800s, nobody had found a fossil of a bird with feathers yet. So everyone had to go off of things like beak shape, which was useful, but also skeletal features like the wishbone, which isn't very useful because lots of other animals have those. Without feathers to provide a clear link to birds, many scientists interpreted Archaeopteryx as a kind of feathered dinosaur. This view was popularized by a paleontologist named O.C. Marsh, who came up with the name Maniraptora in 1888 to describe a group of animals that were intermediate between dinosaurs and birds. But as the years went on and more fossils were discovered, it became clear that Maniraptora wasn't really a natural group. In other words, it wasn't a group of animals that all shared a recent common ancestor. Instead, it was a mishmash of unrelated animals that all looked kind of bird-like. Paleontologists kept searching for the true ancestors of birds, but they kept coming up short. That's partly because they were looking in the wrong places. Birds evolved in the supercontinent of Gondwana, not in what is now North America. And to make matters worse, nearly every potential ancestor was smaller than a chicken, which means it would have been extremely unlikely for us to find one in the fossil record to begin with. Finally, in 2009, a team of paleontologists described a new species named Ankylosaurus. And unlike previous candidates, Ankylosaurus had unambiguous bird-like features. It was only about the size of a sparrow, but it had feathers, a wishbone, and a special bone structure in its feet that's found only in birds. Although Ankylosaurus lived about 100 million years before Archaeopteryx, it was likely an ancestor of that species. And because it was found in China, it provided strong evidence that birds originated in Asia. So while Archaeopteryx may not be the first bird, it's still an important piece of the puzzle. And it turns out that the quarry worker who found it had a good eye for spotting significant fossils. After finding Archaeopteryx, he went on to discover the fossils of a relative in a nearby quarry. Turns out he was sitting on a literal gold mine, or maybe a fossil mine.